for joining our Ask Me Anything about how to manage the translation, localization, and transcreation of your chat or voice experience. This topic is backed by popular demand from our December AMA. So we are all really excited to continue the conversation. Many of the panelists who were there in December are with us today. So thank you for giving so much of your time. And we're also very excited to welcome our new panelists, Anna and Rihanna. And Rihanna is tuning in at midnight her time, so huge thank you to her for doing this as well. And let me do some introductions. So Madeline, let me find your bio. Okay, Madeline is a linguist by training whose specialties include conversation, ethnography, language revitalization, language ideologies, and language in performance. Her work experience includes UX content strategy, technical communication, research, education, multilingual translation management, and intercultural communication. Madeline speaks American Sign Language, French, Breton, and Japanese, as well as English, and has lived in Japan and France, as well as the US. Thank you for being with us today, Madeline.
Happy to be here.
And Micah. Micah is an award-winning conversational UX designer and strategist, keynote speaker, trainer, and co-author of the Voice UX workbook, which I can personally vouch for. It is an amazing workbook. With over a decade of experience. Go ahead, Micah.
I was just going to say thank you for that compliment, Riel.
Yeah. Divyansh, would you mind putting a link to that in the chat? Because it is awesome. It's on Amazon, right, Micah?
Yes, it's currently out of print, but for not a long time anymore because we're making some updates. So yeah.
Cool. So anyone who's interested in that, keep an eye on that for the next edition. With over a decade of experience in linguistics and experience design, Micah found conversational UX the perfect blend of those two worlds. And she is passionate about bridging the gap between brands and their customers and creating connection with conversations. Thank you for being here today, Micah.
Very happy to continue the conversation, really, because I remember off the back of the December AMA, we all felt like we could have still gone on for hours.
Mm-hmm. Me too. All right, Rihanna. Rihanna hails from the Philippines with a degree in mass media and has been working at Mother Tongue Singapore for 3 years. Starting as account manager, mostly focused on Transcreation project for mobile applications, marketing, and advertising campaigns, she is now a program manager for a digital voice assistant product covering transcreation and content origination in languages across the world. Given the nature of her work combined with her personal curiosity, Rihanna has maintained strong interest in voice assistants and chatbots. Thank you for being with us today, Rihanna. And we have Anna. Anna is a freelance conversation designer based in Copenhagen, Denmark. She has training in linguistics and cognitive semiotics and started her career as a translator 10 years ago. Joining the field of conversational AI, she has worked on chatbot projects in several languages, drawing on her expertise in communication, multilingual translation, and localization. Anna speaks several languages. She's native in Russian and Ukrainian. Thank you for being here today, Anna.
Thank you.
And Jillian. Jillian has her master's in teaching English as a second language and Spanish, and did a 1.5 years of PhD coursework in applied linguistics. She knew she wanted to work in the cross-section of tech, linguistics, and Spanish, and did so while she worked as a modeler and trainer for Apple's Siri in Spanish. Thank you for joining us today, Jillian. And we have attendees registered from all over the world, so thank you for being with us today. Really quickly, this session is being recorded and it will be emailed to you. As you go ahead and ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A feature, whichever one you prefer. We'll keep an eye on both of them. And panelists, if you see a question in the chat that you want to directly respond to in the chat, feel free to do that. Or if you want to respond to it speaking, feel free to do that too. We can keep this pretty flexible. So without further ado, Anna, would you like to start us off with what are the benefits of being multilingual as a UX designer for voice products?
Yeah, sure. So to start with, I would say that what does it mean being multilingual? Knowledge of many languages, it to a certain extent enhances your cognitive flexibility. It gives you more linguistic perspectives and cultural perspectives. You can have a better awareness of how people in other cultures will perceive and structure the world. So when you design a product for another country or you work on localization, this will help you to understand how to structure the conversation flow, how to design a personality, what are the conversational habits and linguistic norms. And if the product will be used by non-native speakers, it also, like, you can relate to their experience to some extent. And then I would add that it also helps to do market analysis if you need to compare certain types of conversation agents across countries. I think that's it for a start, and I'd like to hear others.
Thanks, Anna. Jillian, what are your thoughts?
Wow, I mean, I'm trying just to think about what to even add on top of that. She hit the nail on the head for sure. It just allows you to have, you take yourself and you just can amplify yourself by as many other languages and cultures that you know about. You're able to help that company to make sure that they're not totally leaving something out that's a blind spot for them. And also for you, it helps you to open up all of your career opportunities. You've got access to more jobs. So that's good too.
Madeline.
I just want to second everything that's been said. I think it's really spot on. It's really important to be aware of also how non-native speakers will be able to understand wording you choose. So as you develop your skills in other languages, you'll realize how it's different from being a native speaker. And that helps to inform your design in the long run.
Awesome. Micah, how do you best manage translations when the designers are separate from the translators? What is the handoff or collaboration like?
So I see the separate, it's kind of between hyphens. And the reason, and that makes me happy because we should always try and be as close as possible to the translation team involved. And the reason why that is because obviously designing for voice user interfaces and the language that goes with it are very closely knit together. The fact that having a throw over the wall kind of experience has, in my experience, always been a very painful process. So a lot of the time when you think about putting in place a process of transcreation for a product, one of the first things you need to think about is this collaboration with the translators, and what kind of translators are you going for? Because that's also really important, because translators are not just kind of one kind of hybrid of all sorts of things. There are different translators that are there's literary translators who are more versed in literary language. There's technical translators more versed in technical writing. There's all sorts of translators. I have personally found that, for example, translators with an experience in translating scripts for cinema or audio have this kind of affinity with dialogue that makes the whole process a lot easier. And a lot of the time when it comes to that handoff, that collaboration, It starts with elaborating a process. A lot of the time, when I start to think about transcreating a product, the first thing, the first step is saying, okay, well, recruit the right kind of translators to be working with. A second step is then saying, okay, well, coach these translators on what it means, what is conversation design, what is voice user interface design, what's so specific about it. And that takes a bit of time. Then also having them experiment with voice user interfaces, not just with the one you're trying to transcreate with them, but with other voice applications, with other VUIs over the phone, with even with other chatbots, so that they really get a feel of what is the experience like, not only the experience that they're transcreating, but overall the conversational interface. What are some of the challenges? What are some of the possible pitfalls? And like in a multilingual setting, and having them experience that firsthand. And it takes a bit of time, and it adds obviously to the cost and the time they need to do the transcreation, but it helps you gain so much more time. When you compare it with a very different process where it's just like, oh, I'll hand you off this Excel sheet with all the prompts, and you just put the translations next to it, which you could do. Like I've experienced both approaches. And when you do that kind of approach, what happens is then you go about and test it with native speakers, you yourself kind of going over it, because being multilingual also helps you. It's not because you are multilingual and you're the conversation designer on the team that you necessarily need to be doing the transcreation. Sometimes it helps that you're a multilingual conversation designer, someone else, a native speaker transcreator of that purpose language, target language, does the transcreation, but it allows you then to go in and test. And when you have this kind of G-sheet handoff, a lot of the time what you then notice when you kind of do that Q&A of that transcreation, what happens is that you see, oh, well, this kind of was translated like you would translate a book, and you'd have like separate sentences, but they don't have a picture of the entire story. And then sometimes what was a closed question initially in the source language suddenly became an open question in the target language, or options were given in a different order, and so the entire conversational flow gets messed up, and you have to iterate and iterate again, which becomes painful for you and for the transcreator, because they don't necessarily have done a bad job. They have done a wonderful job, only they didn't have the entire context of where all of this was happening. So yeah, anyway.
I would have to agree with a lot of what Mike had already said, because I'm coming into this panel with more experience on project management. And the process that Micah was already describing is actually what I am experiencing every day, I guess, of my life, where you do have, I would have to really stress on the recruiting the right people. The field of voice and even chatbots is fairly new, so you really have to take some time to coach people, and that process is already time consuming on its own. But of course, not everyone has that same affinity towards tech in general, and sometimes they just can't see that big perspective, so you'll have to really do a lot of training on that front. But when it comes to being an LSP, you have to take in kind of that work from the client, you middleman it, and then you send it to your writers, right? So on that perspective, a lot of what Micah had already described is something that we experience, whereby you do have a potential where there are situations that context is lost. But for us, what we do, because we do kind of mediate the process. As project managers, what we do is we assess what the client has requested of us. And on that perspective, we try our best to identify like what tools we need for that process. So if it's a regular client, of course, you'll be provided with their own tools, their own systems, their own CMS on how they handle the process of voice or even their chatbots. So if you have that, that is the best scenario because you have direct access to the content itself. But if you're dealing with other projects where it is only handed off as a G sheet to you, then you also have to identify on the client side, like how much involvement would we need to be a part of on the process? Like, would they need the linguists or the transcreators to be in touch with the engineering team? And in some cases, we've handled projects like that in mother tongue where we get the linguists in touch with the engineering team. And of course, the talent that you work with at that point has to understand a bit of the engineering jargons, and which is also a pain point at times, because not everyone can speak the engineering teams or the design teams language. And that's where I guess miscommunication can happen. But of course, if you yourself as a project manager, or if you're in a position that you manage these type of projects, those are the things that you'll have to be on the lookout for, and something that you'll have to smoothen out while handling the project itself. Yeah, that's it from my end.
Thank you. Micah and Rihanna, just a quick follow-up question. So Micah, you mentioned, you know, if you just give them a Google sheet with the prompts in one column and then like where the translation should be in the next one, sometimes it can really help to visualize how a process goes based in the literal tools that are being used for it. So like Google Sheets is one way of doing it, as opposed to what would be like the other tools that would mediate the first process that you explained. And Rihanna, same question to you.
I'm not sure if I got that right as well. In cases where you do have to handle the process with a Google Sheet, it's a bit tough to say like how to provide context on that. Ideally, I guess now I'm going to speak on like a regular transcreation project where you handle a source and then you send that to the linguist. It would ideally help if you have a kind of a draft on where it's going to be like a UI mock-up on where these prompts are going to appear. That help in building out the context on where the prompts are going to be used. Also, it would help if there's like a live version that the writers or the linguists can use to identify or test potentially what is already the existing content. But if it's really from scratch, then I guess that would be a point where you would have to ask access to a testing environment from the client that would help give more context to the writers. Does that answer the question? I hope it does.
Yeah, I think so. So you're saying ideally the process is much more robust than, hand off the Google Sheet or hand off the Google Doc.
Yeah. The more context that you can provide, the better. If the bot or the voice has a brand guideline, that would also help. It would provide the context on like, okay, if this is the question and this is your answer, what kind of tone do you have to take when you're answering that type of question? And that helps in crafting the transcreation. But yeah, overall, the more context that you can provide to the linguist, apart from just the direct G sheet, then that would be helpful.
Okay, so the live system helps, maybe videos help, screenshots, a brand Bible, maybe in like document form, the flow itself.
So for projects that I have worked on in the past, definitely setting up the Transcreator with an environment where he can test the conversation and both the conversational flow and the actual copy of what's going on in situ has definitely made the biggest difference. So whether that is through a prototype or whether that is through a live version of something that exists already. So that has definitely been a major game changer. Another thing that is also really useful is if you have some sort of content management system that you can put behind that. And when those two work in collaboration, when it is somewhere where the content is managed per language in a nicely set and comprehensible way, and then tie that with an ability to test as you go, then that has been kind of the winning formula to get that more complex process going of really immersing the Transcreator into what is conversation design, how does it happen, and like with everything, collaboration and communication is obviously key. And as a conversation designer, as you are collaborating with Transcreators, I like to think of the fact that it's kind of a route that you go together. It's not like, here's the thing, do it. It's like, let's do this together. We can communicate, ask each other questions. And sometimes it's also the Transcreator that has a lot of linguistic knowledge and experience that says, well, in your source language, you kind of have written this prompt in this way, but do you think like it wouldn't be nicer if you could, hey, like using these words would be nice? Or and sometimes it's even a Transcreator that kind of informs or gives good ideas to the conversation designer as well. It's kind of a back and forth of how do we make the best experience for the end user across languages. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anyone else want to jump in with anything? Should we move to the next one? Cool. Jillian, how do you manage multilingual datasets?
Oh, yay. Oh, my word. So, I mean, for datasets, for me, this is a lot of like the input and stuff. Oh, my word. My best advice would be just to pick a system and stick with it and be really consistent in where you're housing everything, be consistent in communicating the location of that information to your team so that they are not trying to piece together random other data sets and things like that. That would be my number one for the management of that. And yeah, it gets more and more complex the more and more languages that you have. But yeah, you should have some internal systems just to stay organized and just warehouse it in one spot.
And I get that probably a lot of these systems are just internally built products. For any of us out here that have never seen or touched one of those, could you give an idea of like how they're structured, what the format is, like how, like what they enable you to do essentially, or what your ideal tool enables you to be able to do with that data set?
Oh my word. So, okay, yeah, with the data sets, are we talking about user data?
Yeah, great question.
All the utterances?
Whatever you
Because this could be a lot of things. There's data sets. I'll go ahead just with the training and test data sets that you need to run for training a chatbot. An ideal one, it would first of all just have a written guide, just like the homepage of just here's what all these tabs mean and here's what's housed in each tab. I would ideally like for the interface just to be very clean, perhaps have some color coding so that you can, in conversation with other coworkers, reference to the colors of things if you wanted to. it does just help a lot when there's just a really clean user interface and there's very clear buttons and you know what those buttons are supposed to do. A lot of times they're a little bit fragile and so they break because it's a huge data set. And that's usually not anybody's fault, but you have to just be patient with them breaking sometimes and being a bit fragile. Being able to scroll through a lot of data at once is always helpful because when it's only 50 at a time and you're going through 3,000, it's tedious. Yeah.
Awesome.
I'll stop there. I could keep going, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, and then in terms of like, this isn't necessarily data, but this is more content. If you have a system in French, Spanish, English, what is like your ideal UI to be able to keep track of all of those with your team?
I've only really seen one UI and it was all written in English, all of the basic stuff. So sorry to break it to anybody. A lot of this stuff in chatbot world is done first in English, is done, built out. We've got all the taxonomies and the ontologies and the synonym lists and things like that that are written in English first. Then secondary comes all of the other languages. And so unfortunately they are in English usually.
You've more done it in terms of like you have the entire English one and then you'll have just a totally different document or project for like the Spanish one versus keeping them both and kind of like in tandem in the same kind of document.
I'm trying to think about who made the document at my previous workplace. Basically all of the basic stuff was in English. And so all of the guidebook and the defining of the scope of certain intents were done in English first. And then there was a link in tandem in Spanish. Then it was just, again, what the scope is written in Spanish. And so all the other languages, it was in tandem. And so they weren't completely separate things. It was, I log on and it's in English at first. The system knows that I'm a Spanish person. And so it links me to the Spanish stuff. My coworker over here is in Chinese. Hers goes to Chinese. And so we're all using basically the same user interface. So we can talk about things in English, about how to find certain things.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that. I know I'm like digging kind of deep. All right, Madeline, what is the biggest difference between translation and localization?
A simple way to think about it is translation is going from language to language. And that's what we're most familiar with in general in the broader culture. Localization is specifically saying, I'm going to adapt something to this particular country, to this particular market. And so it's much broader than just the language. So part of it's the language, but it's also a very specific version of the language, it's a very local version, local variety of the language. It's also, you might even go more specific than a country. So you might go to a regional version of something as well. And that would be a variety, what most people call dialects. So when you're adapting something to a local area, you're making it work for that particular region. And for example, let's say you have a product and everything's in American English. So localization might be adapting it to Canada, to the UK, to New Zealand, to Australia, to Singapore, to India. Anywhere where English is spoken, you would want to adapt the product probably because there's going to be different vocabulary. There are different maybe expressions or greetings. There might be different curse words. There's going to be national references. There's going to be a local money system that you might be referencing. Time references are different. So there's a lot of things you need to adapt that are specific to a country or a location. and it's not just the language.
And Madeline, when you were creating interfaces in Japan, did you do any regional localization, or was it mostly anyone in Japan would be able to connect with this particular user experience?
In the work that I did, actually, it was from Japanese to English and then English to other languages. So it was a different situation. This was the PlayStation way back in the day. So not a chatbot way before all that. And so there was not, it was focused very much on countries.
Okay.
A lot of countries, but just countries.
Cool. Rihanna, what do you think is the biggest difference between translation and localization?
I think Madeline had already nailed it on the head. I think we'll all be in agreement that those are the main differences, and you want to, in localization, you want to be able to adapt your source language into your target market, even on what messaging you want to portray, and that is, I guess, the biggest difference between both in that sense. And I always think of translation that it's really more concerned towards being accurate from language to language. Like you try as much as possible that the apple in source language is an apple in target language. That's how I would usually put it. With localization, you try to take the apple and find a local apple that is native to that country, and you try and your best to source that and try to manifest that.
Thanks, Rihanna. Anna, what are your thoughts?
There was a lot good things already said. I would just add that maybe as a UX designer of a digital product, when you think about local translation and localization, if translation means changing maybe some texts in your chatbots, localization means fully like changing your whole product, your chatbot. So it, as was said already, a complex process. You don't just adjust the language, translate the text. You also might change if it's a chatbot, conversational flows. You might change the way the dialogue is shaped. You might remove some parts, add some parts because they're just not adaptable for this culture. You might change something in the user interface if you have some visuals in your chatbot because something maybe doesn't work for this specific situation in this specific country. And then you also do usability testing and a lot of quality assurance for the final product. So it's a more complex process when you don't just work with the language only, although it's essential part, but there are a lot of other parts of the product that you change, and there might be also some development coding involved. That's how I would understand it.
Thanks, Anna. Micah, what do you think?
Well, these wonderful ladies have all made very great points already about translation and localization. And I couldn't have said it any better. I think what's important for us to highlight perhaps is that sometimes when you are putting together a product and you are set on localizing your product for different markets, different countries, it's also good to be aware of the fact that translation and localization go together, and sometimes it's not an or translation or localization, but it's both. And I think specifically in countries that have so many languages, with different languages in different regions, like in India, for example, where there are so many languages. So it's also about those two working together closely and finding the right balance and the right priorities when you are thinking about localizing and translating your product for a certain market is making sure that, one, you pick the right target audience, to make sure that you are not excluding loads and loads and loads of people because you have just happened to pick English, and it might be more straightforward to localize than to translate plus localize. And then last thing, which is a bit of a challenge, is especially when it comes to voice user interface design, obviously there are still quite a few languages for which we are not able to create experiences yet, because there is no NLU available for that given language or that given regional language or dialect. So yeah, just something to be aware of.
Thanks, Micah. And we are about halfway through, so it's time for a quick message from our sponsor, Botmock. And I love that in the chat, I really hope I don't say your name wrong. Apolline or Apolline, probably got it wrong, I'm sorry, mentioned that their ideal is a visualization where they can change the language at the click of a button. Well, I'm excited to say that Botmock allows you to do that. If you ever need to translate a flow, try Botmock out. And we have a promo code that will be valid for 2 hours. So you can get a month free pro Botmock account with that. And yeah, I hope it unlocks your transcreation and localization dreams. And without further ado, we will continue with Jillian. How do you handle language mixing? For example, Hinglish or Spanglish for the many households that speak in multiple languages.
All right, so I'm gonna come at this from just the perspective of how to create a virtual assistant or a chatbot. A lot of times, it's basically it just is, if your company decides to speak to their customers in Spanglish, that's totally cool. You obviously need to be aware of that. It's such a small percentage of people who do that, and the people who do are bilingual. And so sometimes we do just kind of have to say, that's cool, and then funnel them to one of the languages that they speak. It would be trying to please everybody too much. So for the Spanglish stuff, in going through then what I see users inputting into the virtual assistant will be Spanglish. And we have to train the chatbot to recognize those English words that are in there sometimes, and not just totally throw out all of that info, especially if there's a lot of that information. And so we need to you need to just add English synonyms to your Spanish list, basically. So it's a fine balance game, but that's what I would recommend doing.
To add to what Jillian had said, I'd probably give some examples in Singlish because we handle that kind of work as well, and also coming from the perspective that there's some background that you have to remember about your product, either your brand, your persona, or your character or your attribute, before you craft an answer to address the user's intents here. And when we get questions from our users that are a mix of these language, let's say Singlish, and they say, tell me a joke la. The la, you have English there, like tell me a joke, but your la is very uniquely Singlish, and you just can't say that, I don't have that feature yet. And you have to meet them at that level. So when you write your answers, of course, your joke that you need to deliver is something unique to that language. But ideally, that would default to the base language that you're writing your content in. So if that question from the user comes in from your English Singapore variant, then your answer should be skewed to English Singapore, and your answer has to consider your brand guidelines. If your brand guideline says that you're their friend and you should be smart with your words, then you can recognize that, like, oh, okay, I know what you mean, but this is how I will answer you at that degree. But if it's more crude, like very bad words, they're literally throwing you the rudest of slangs that they can throw you. That is, of course, when you enforce a really strict tone with them, where that, you just stay within the realm of your tone of voice or your brand's guideline when it comes to writing. But of course, in voice, at least, you want to be able to meet the user at the level that they're throwing you to, because that is part of their experience with your product. And it's a gray area that's very tricky to tread on, but it's an interesting area nonetheless, because that's where you also identify, like, oh, your users are transforming their ways of asking the question, and that in turn allows you to enrich the experience that they have with your product. So it's just really trying to harp back on your product's brand guidelines.
That's a really interesting example, Rihanna. It makes me think of, so I have a Mac Pro that has the like digital touch screen at the top of it. And when I type, oftentimes it will, like if I type bird, a little bird emoji will actually show up in the touch screen, and I can just tap that and it will give me that emoji. And I find this amazing. And now I'm so lazy when it comes to emojis. Like if I can't just type it and it shows up and I press it, I'm not putting an emoji. So when I type in Spanish, because sometimes I'm in the support channels talking in Spanish, as soon as it picks up that I've spoken in Spanish and then I type bird is not Spanish, but it's already like, it already knows that I'm speaking in Spanish. So it's like changed its mindset, and then the emoji won't show up because for all it cares, bird doesn't mean anything in Spanish. So it like, and I'm always so frustrated by this. And I should probably test out, I've actually never tested whether it'll work if I write a Spanish word. I should try that. I don't know why I haven't, but yeah, it's hard when you're language mixing for sure. But I love that you said it can kind of tell you something about what they're expecting back and enhance their experience if you can handle it gracefully. Anyone else want to weigh in on this? This is such an interesting topic. It's a hard thing to do.
Sorry, just I guess to add, I'm not sure with other, I think maybe in the future AI would step in and help us out with this. But with, I think the technical limitations at the moment when you have, the language pre-settings, I guess that's where your limitations would be at the moment, because you want to make sure that you handle these type of questions and meet the users at the level of engagement that they want, but then you also don't want to compromise that your whole content is skewed just for this. I think that is an opportunity for AI in the future to help us bridge that gap on language presettings.
Yeah, great point too. Things are changing fast with AI and how it's going to be playing bigger and bigger parts in our designs. That could be a whole AMA in and of itself, I think. Micah, how do you coach translators about chatbot design?
So we kind of touched on this in the beginning of this session, but a lot of the time in the past, what I've done is, while working with translators and coaching them about conversation design, is actually doing them a kind of a concise course of what is conversation design, kind of doing a little, I really like workshops, that's my thing, and collaborating. And so a lot of the time what I will do is I kind of will take the translator through a small conversation design workshop like I would do with a client, and kind of to make them aware of what are some of the challenges, how has this conversation design that I'm now asking them to transcreate taken place, how has it all taken form throughout the project. So I take them on a little journey of creating a small conversation design most of the time, doing kind of a co-creation workshop. I also like to do with translators that have never really done any conversation design work in the past, a little serious game of my making, where I give them a card and they have some constraints, and we have a dialogue, and so they need to find out what I've done over the weekend, what my favorite sport is, and what's the name of my dog, and then the other participant has like these cards that says whatever you do, don't say a thing, with some of the conversation design constraints that you can have around things that can happen with the chatbot, like unparsed intents, and it really gives for a nice moment of serious play, but more than that, it sparks aha moments of, oh yeah, wow, this is how conversation design is tricky, and this is things I need to be aware of as I am kind of transcreating, for example, a question or setting up a question, so that I make sure that all of these other things then can possibly happen, and possible ways that this conversation can go wrong, that I kind of mitigate for that, just like you would do when you are crafting your prompts for your conversation design. So yes, a lot of kind of collaboration, a bit of serious play, obviously like a mini course and a bit of a workshop, so that they really apprehend the basics, because obviously you can't learn conversation design just like in 2 hours, but you can apprehend the basics of what it is, what are kind of the key elements, the key components, how does this process work, and also what could possibly go wrong. And having that understanding is already kind of a nice foundational set to begin with.
Thanks, Micah. Anna, anything to add?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Micah already mentioned. And I could add just from my experience, we also had another situation when it was not fully an external translator, but it was some kind member of the team who was maybe a copywriter or a communication manager, specialist, who had to take the ownership of this chatbot we're building in the end. Maybe it's a copywriter on the client side. So either that person translates the bot, or we involve other translator, but that person takes the final editing and ownership of the bot. And in this case, it's of course was like a part of our process to spend time educating that person in a conversation design, and maybe going even more than a brief workshops, which I really like how Micah described this process. But in our case, we often had like a training course explaining even how you build data set, how you add intents, why the chatbot answers has such responses and such requests in different parts of the conversational flow, and also explaining maybe even a bit of NLP, how it works, so that the person who will be the owner of this bot afterwards and will manage it has a more deeper understanding. But of course, sometimes it was just a translator involved on a small, for a small step of the project to translate some parts. And then we try to do as much briefing into conversation design as possible. But I have to say, sometimes it also could be limited by the project scope. And it's something maybe as a designer, I have to agree with the product manager that we really need to do it, because yeah, it's important, as was already mentioned today at the webinar, it's important the translator understands some principles and understands how this chatbot, this product functions.
Good point. Yeah, and I would also add that for something like voice or chat experiences, well, specifically voice, it can be like so helpful if you're trying to kind of explain to someone or teach someone in a workshop why time is needed to be spent on this. Videos or live examples are like will help you out so much, because it's really more about the feeling, and it's hard to kind of grasp on paper why you need this instead of this. But as soon as you see it in practice, as soon as you see that woman on the IVR or that person speaking to the voice assistant and they get tripped up, or it just like, as soon as it's spoken, it like comes to life as to why that shouldn't be done, or maybe why it should be done. So I've had a lot of success with that.
Yeah, I would agree, Brielle, and that is also the case sometimes, and that's I think it's one of the following topics that we are discussing. It's also the case when you kind of want to showcase that, no, it's not a good idea to do everything in an automated way when it comes to transcreation, and showcasing what an automated translation versus a non-automated one would look like, often does the trick also to drive that point home. Yeah.
Thanks, Micah. Really quick, because we have 7 minutes left. There is one question in the chat from Jesus about books, websites, blogs that anyone recommends on multilingual chatbot design. So if attendees have suggestions or panelists, feel free to type those in. Also in the Q&A, we have a question from earlier, 2 questions. Chatbots have very narrow and specific use cases. So how do you segment the type of language output that may be needed? And then the follow-up, that chatbot localization is not about translation of the training data. A bot must be aware of the sociocultural nuances that speakers of a language use. So does it mean that for every language you have to come up with a new data set from scratch? They're not referring to an FAQ type bot, but more a deep learning based bot that processes information beyond matching strings. Those are really good questions, and any panelists that want to take a stab at answering them or typing out the answer in the Q&A, feel free to. I don't know if we'll have time to, unless someone wants to pitch in right now and talk about it. But I don't want to spring this question on you.
Yeah, because those are really big questions. And I was actually thinking too about the data set of user data, and if it's necessary that the user data needs to be in the target language. I actually don't know that answer. I've only ever dealt with having the user data in like my language, either English or Spanish. And I've seen other coworkers only dealing with the language in their own languages too. So I don't know if it would be possible to be using your training and test sets in, say, English, and then you are getting input in Spanish, and then you're able to trigger it. I don't know. Do you guys know the answer to that?
I don't know the answer.
I might have to like ask some coworkers and stuff and just see, because it's blowing my mind. It could be possible or it could not be possible. I'm not really sure.
Okay.
So
Cool.
one of the projects I worked on, and it's not entirely the answer, Gillian, but one of the projects I worked on, we did a large task with a certain amount of data, like in the data set, with we did a quantitative test with quite some users, to see whether if we used kind of the same kind of data set just translated for the input, and same thing for the output. And then we had users test that like on big volume. And what we had found is that whereas for the input, the data set still was quite performant, even though it was just kind of translated without really having that extra level of kind of localization and extra level of specific kind of keywords that a user would use. It still got matched pretty neatly. Like the percentages were a bit lower, obviously, than it would be in kind of a native language, but it was still decent enough to have a good user experience. The problem occurred more on the output side of things, where the just translating broke the conversational flow. So yeah, so I would say that it's a bit of a test and learn experience, really. So you kind of, we tested a long time with a big data set. It took time and effort, and but I guess if you start with a small data set, test if that works, and do you really need that extra kind of layer or level. And also, I think it depends greatly on project scope and on, unfortunately, like with everything in life, budget and time. But yeah.
Thanks, Micah. Cool. So I think we've addressed all the live questions that have come in. We have 2 minutes, and I know all of us are on tight schedules. It's 1 a.m. in Singapore, and I know that most of us have a hard stop. So I don't want to open up any more questions. We still somehow didn't even manage to get through half of the content. So maybe we'll need another one later this year. The other thing is that we may test out like asynchronous AMA format where everyone gets on Slack at the same time and the experts just type their responses to questions as they come in for over the course of an hour. And then we can basically take all those and compile them into a blog post. So, so yeah, maybe we'll experiment with that for a follow-up if our attendee or if our panelists would want to. I know that for some of you, this is already the second round. So if you want to say no, that's totally cool. And yeah, I think with that, this was another amazing conversation. So thank you all for being with us today. And someone mentioned wanting to network with everyone. So if you want to throw your LinkedIn or Twitter in the chat, if you're cool with people finding you and connecting with you, that would be great. I'll keep the room open for like another minute or so, and maybe put on some music, and hope everyone has a great rest of their morning, afternoon, or evening.
Thank you, Brielle, for having us. It was wonderful talking with all these wonderful people again. Just like last time, we could have gone on for hours.
Right.
And experiences, and yeah, we should do this more often.
Yeah, we should.
Yeah, maybe we could also test out Clubhouse, although it's not the most accessible at this point in time, but once it's on Android, maybe we can think about that too. That could be cool.
Yeah, thank you. We have so much that we could cover. It could be a series.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brielle, for having us, for being a lovely host and doing a great job at moderating. Really appreciate it. And thanks to Devansh as well for kind of the logistics and behind the screen wonderfulness.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Yeah,
Talk to you later.
Have a good weekend.
be
All
safe.
right. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.